Some marriages do not end with screaming. They end when a woman goes quiet. The rain had started just after midnight. Soft at first. A whisper against the tall windows of Blackmere House. Then steadier. Colder. The kind of October rain that turned the garden silver beneath the moonlight and wrapped the estate in a silence too heavy for sleep. Cecilia Whitmore stood alone in the north corridor with one hand resting lightly against the wall beside her. The candles along the hallway had burned low an hour ago. Their dim light trembled across the marble floor and turned the portraits of dead dukes into shadows with eyes. She had not meant to stop there. She had only intended to return to her chambers after the charity supper downstairs. That was all. One quiet evening. One more performance of dignity beside a husband who had not touched her hand in nearly 8 months. But then she heard Lucien's voice beyond the library door. Low. Controlled. Intimate in a way it had never been with her. Cecilia slowed without realizing it. The library door was not fully closed. Warm firelight stretched through the narrow opening and across the dark floorboards near her slippers. She should have walked away. A well-bred Duchess knew when not to hear certain things. But then Lucien laughed softly. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Worse. Genuine. Cecilia had almost forgotten what that sounded like. You know I love your sister. The words were quiet. Barely above a whisper. Still, they landed with the precision of something sharpened long ago. Inside the library, Vivian Whitmore laughed beneath her breath. Lucien, if Cecilia heard you say that, she would faint dead away. Cecilia does not faint. His tone remained calm. Certain. That is part of the problem. Cecilia did not move. For one strange second her body forgot how. The corridor remained perfectly still around her. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere downstairs a grandfather clock struck 1. She stared at the thin line of light beneath the library door while something inside her became terribly quiet. Not broken. Not shattered. Quiet. As though her heart had simply stepped backward and closed a door behind itself. Vivian said something else. Cecilia no longer heard it clearly. Blood rushed softly in her ears. She became aware of small things instead. The cold edge of the wall beneath her fingertips. The loose thread near the cuff of her glove. The fact that one candle beside the staircase had nearly burned itself out. Strange, the details a person notices at the exact moment their marriage ends. Then Lucien spoke again. She deserves someone gentler than me. Cecilia closed her eyes once. Only once. Because that was almost kindness. And somehow kindness hurt more. She opened her eyes again and straightened her spine. When she finally moved, her footsteps made no sound against the carpet runner. No one inside the library noticed her leave. Her chambers sat at the far end of the east wing overlooking the cliffs beyond Blackmere Lake. Lucien had chosen those rooms for her himself after their wedding 3 years earlier because the morning light there was less severe. She remembered the exact words because they had once sounded thoughtful. Now they felt clinical. Cecilia entered the room without summoning her maid. The fireplace had burned low. Embers glowed faintly beneath white ash. Her wedding portrait above the mantel watched her with borrowed happiness. She removed her gloves carefully and placed them beside the jewelry tray. Then she sat at the edge of the bed without removing her coat. The silence inside the room expanded slowly. She had imagined this moment before. Not this exact sentence perhaps, but the shape of it. Every woman married to a distant man imagines eventually that she may not be loved. The truly dangerous thing was realizing he loved someone else gently. Her gaze drifted toward the window. Rainwater slid down the glass in silver lines. Beyond the dark lawn, the lake reflected fragments of moonlight like shattered mirrors. Cecilia remained very still. Then she laughed once under her breath. Softly. Almost politely. Because suddenly everything made sense. The missed anniversaries. The coldness. The endless courtesy that never became warmth. The way Lucien always seemed more alive in rooms she had just left. And Vivian. Beautiful Vivian. Bright enough to warm every ballroom she entered without ever noticing who stood in the shadows keeping the candles lit behind her. Cecilia reached toward the bedside table and opened the drawer. Inside rested a stack of letters tied with pale blue ribbon. Letters she had written Lucien during the first year of their marriage, and never given him. She touched the ribbon lightly, then closed the drawer again. There seemed little point now. A knock came at the door 20 minutes later. 3 measured taps. Lucien. Cecilia knew immediately. No servant knocked like that. She rose and crossed the room before opening it herself. Lucien Ravenscroft stood outside in shirt sleeves and dark trousers, one hand resting against the frame. At 34, the Duke of Blackmere carried authority the way other men carried height. Naturally. Effortlessly. His dark hair remained slightly damp from the rain outside. His gray eyes settled on her face with familiar restraint. You left the library early. Cecilia stepped aside automatically. I was tired. He entered the room. The scent of cedarwood and rain followed him inside. For a moment neither spoke. Lucien glanced toward the dying fire. You should have called for more coal. I did not notice the cold. His gaze returned to her then. Longer this time, as though something about her posture had shifted slightly out of place. Is something wrong? Cecilia looked at him quietly. The man she had married. The man London feared in Parliament and obeyed in silence. The man who once stood beside her during a storm at sea and wrapped his coat around her shoulders without a word. The man who had just whispered love to another woman. No, she said softly. Nothing is wrong. Lucien studied her another second, then nodded once, accepting the answer because he always accepted the answers she gave him. That was the tragedy of their marriage. Cecilia had become too good at being composed. He moved toward the fireplace and adjusted one of the logs with the iron poker. Vivian leaves for Rosebridge tomorrow. Cecilia folded her hands together lightly. Does she? Her carriage departs after breakfast. I hope the weather improves for her journey. Lucien looked back at her. There was the faintest crease between his brows now. Confusion perhaps. Or disappointment. As though he had expected something sharper from her. Cecilia almost pitied him then. Because he still believed the night remained ordinary. You should sleep, he said finally. It is late. Yes. He stepped toward her slowly. Close enough that she could see the faint exhaustion beneath his eyes. Lucien always looked tired these days. As though carrying some invisible weight he refused to set down. For one impossible moment, Cecilia wondered whether to ask him directly. Whether courage might still save something between them. But then she remembered the softness in his voice downstairs. No. Love spoken naturally could not be argued away. Lucien touched her shoulder briefly before leaving. The gesture was familiar. Gentle even. A habit rather than affection. When the door closed behind him, Cecilia stood motionless in the center of the room. Then she turned toward the wardrobe. Outside, the rain continued falling over Blackmere House while somewhere deep beneath the cliffs, dark water struck stone again and again without mercy. Cecilia began packing at 2:15 in the morning. Not dramatically. Not with shaking hands or tears staining silk gloves. She folded each dress with the calm precision of a woman arranging flowers for guests she no longer intended to meet. The clock beside the fireplace ticked softly through the room. Rain continued against the windows. Somewhere below, the household slept beneath layers of stone and candle smoke, unaware that the Duchess of Blackmere was preparing to disappear before dawn. She opened the wardrobe and reached for the dark blue traveling dress she had worn during their first winter at Blackmere House. Lucien had once looked up from his correspondence when she entered the breakfast room wearing it. Blue suits you, he had said absently before returning to his papers. It was the closest thing to admiration he had offered in months. Cecilia laid the dress carefully inside the trunk. Strange what women choose to remember when love has already begun dying. She packed lightly. 2 dresses for travel. 1 wool coat. Gloves. Her mother's silver hairbrush. A leather-bound Bible with cracked edges. Nothing that belonged truly to Blackmere House. Nothing Lucien could accuse her of taking. When she crossed toward the writing desk near the window, she paused briefly before sitting down. The candle there had almost burned itself flat. Wax pooled across the brass holder like melted ivory. Cecilia pulled a clean sheet of stationery toward herself. The Ravenscroft crest glimmered faintly at the top of the page. For several seconds she stared at it without writing. Then slowly, she dipped the pen into ink. Dear Lucien. The words remained unfinished. She looked at them a moment longer before folding the paper in half and setting it aside. No. A farewell letter implied there was something left to explain. She reached instead for a smaller card from the drawer beneath. Her handwriting remained perfectly steady this time. Now you are free. Cecilia Whitmore had spent most of her life becoming easy to leave. She understood that suddenly with humiliating clarity. The quiet daughter. The reasonable sister. The woman who never demanded too much. Men admired women like Vivian instantly. They married women like Cecilia gratefully. There was a difference. She sanded the ink lightly and left the card on the center of the desk where Lucien would see it after breakfast. Then she removed her wedding ring. That part hurt unexpectedly. Not because of romance. The pain came from habit. 3 years of unconscious gestures. 3 years of touching the gold band while reading letters or pouring tea or listening to Lucien speak across crowded ballrooms. She rolled the ring once between her fingers before placing it beside the note. The tiny sound against polished wood seemed louder than thunder. Cecilia looked away immediately. Outside the window, lightning flashed far across the lake without sound. The storm was moving east toward the cliffs. She crossed to the fireplace and knelt carefully to stir the dying embers. Flames rose weakly around the blackened wood. Lucien hated waking to cold rooms. The thought came automatically. She almost laughed again. Even now, her body still moved toward caring for him before itself. A soft knock interrupted the silence near 3 o'clock. Cecilia rose at once. Come in. Margaret, her lady's maid, stepped quietly inside carrying folded linens. The older woman stopped immediately when she noticed the open trunk near the bed. Her eyes moved from the packed dresses to Cecilia's face. Your Grace. Cecilia accepted the linens gently. Thank you, Margaret. You may rest now. Margaret did not move. She had served Cecilia since the wedding, long enough to recognize danger when it arrived dressed as calmness. Are you traveling somewhere? Cecilia folded the linens herself and placed them carefully into the trunk. Yes. At this hour? Before sunrise. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. Does His Grace know? Cecilia closed the trunk lid softly. No, the maid lowered her eyes. In great houses, servants survived by understanding which questions could destroy lives. Still, after a moment, Margaret stepped closer. Will you be returning soon? Cecilia looked toward the rain-dark window before answering. I do not believe so. The older woman inhaled quietly. Then, to Cecilia's surprise, Margaret crossed the room and retrieved the heavier wool cloak from the chair near the fire. You will need this, she said softly. Cecilia accepted it without speaking for several seconds. Emotion rose unexpectedly into her throat. Not because of Lucien. Because kindness after heartbreak always arrived too late to defend against it. Thank you. Margaret hesitated near the door. You have been very good to this house, Your Grace. Cecilia smiled faintly. That has never been the problem. After the maid left, the room fell silent again. The clock reached 3:30. Cecilia extinguished 2 candles to save light for the journey. Then she sat beside the window and waited for the sky to begin changing beyond the lake. Blackmere House looked different before dawn. Less powerful somehow. The endless stone corridors and towering staircases softened beneath darkness, until the estate resembled not a fortress, but an exhausted old animal sleeping beneath rain. Cecilia had once loved this house. During her first spring here, she learned every hallway and hidden staircase by heart. She memorized the servants' birthdays, reorganized the kitchens, restored the neglected rose garden outside the western terrace because Lucien's mother had planted it years earlier before illness took her. Lucien noticed all of it without ever understanding what it cost her to become necessary. The cruelest marriages were often the quietest. No shouting. No slammed doors. Only one person slowly disappearing while the other failed to notice until the room became empty. At 4:10, Cecilia heard footsteps pass outside her chambers. Slow. Familiar. She went perfectly still. Lucien. His steps paused briefly near the door. Cecilia stared toward the entrance without breathing. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. Perhaps he considered knocking again. Perhaps he simply stood there remembering something neither of them had managed to save. Then the footsteps continued down the corridor and disappeared toward the west wing. Cecilia lowered her gaze slowly to her folded hands. Goodbye, she whispered into the empty room, though no one remained to hear it. By 5 o'clock the rain had weakened into mist drifting over the grounds. The first pale line of morning appeared beyond the cliffs. Cecilia fastened her gloves carefully and pulled the hood of her traveling cloak over her hair. She carried only one leather bag herself. The larger trunk had already been secured quietly downstairs by Thomas, the stable hand Margaret trusted not to speak. When Cecilia opened the chamber door for the last time, the hallway greeted her with cold gray silence. She stepped into it without hesitation. The portraits watched from the walls as she passed. Ravenscroft dukes with stern faces and painted wives beside them. Women arranged like decorations around powerful men history bothered remembering. Cecilia walked past all of them calmly. At the top of the grand staircase, she paused once and looked down into the entrance hall below. The marble floors reflected faint dawn light through the tall windows. Lucien's riding coat still hung beside the front doors exactly where he had left it the evening before. For one dangerous moment, she imagined him descending the opposite staircase, calling her name, asking her not to go. But the house remained silent. Of course it did. Cecilia adjusted her gloves and continued downward alone. The carriage wheels rolled softly across wet gravel as the gates of Blackmere House disappeared behind the morning fog. Cecilia did not look back immediately. She sat with both hands folded tightly in her lap while pale dawn spread slowly across the countryside beyond the rain-streaked windows. The driver kept the horses at a steady pace along the narrow cliff road leading north. Mist drifted over the hills in long silver ribbons. Bare trees bent gently beneath the October wind. Everything looked cold enough to break. Cecilia finally turned after several minutes. Blackmere House stood far behind them now. Massive, gray, silent against the cliffs overlooking the lake. From a distance, the estate resembled a cathedral abandoned by God himself. No lights burned in the upper windows anymore. No figure stood at the entrance watching her leave. Of course not. Lucien would still be asleep. Or perhaps already awake inside his study with coffee untouched beside his papers, unaware that his wife had vanished before sunrise carrying only one leather case and the remains of her dignity. Cecilia faced forward again and pulled the wool cloak tighter around herself. The inside of the carriage smelled faintly of cedar and rainwater. Beneath the opposite seat rested the small trunk containing what remained of her married life. 3 years reduced to folded dresses and a silver brush. Strange how little space heartbreak required. By 6:30 the storm had passed completely. Thin sunlight touched the rolling fields west of the road, turning the wet grass pale gold beneath the morning sky. Cecilia watched farmhouses appear and disappear between hills while exhaustion settled slowly into her bones. She had not slept. Not truly. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Lucien's voice again. Calm. Intimate. You know I love your sister. Not angry. Not cruel. Honest. That was the wound she could not stop touching. Honesty delivered softly by the man she once believed incapable of emotional intimacy. She leaned her head briefly against the carriage wall. The movement loosened one strand of dark hair from beneath her hood. Outside, a flock of birds lifted suddenly from a flooded field and vanished into the pale morning sky. Cecilia watched them until they disappeared completely. Freedom looked colder than she imagined. Back at Blackmere House, Lucien Ravenscroft woke precisely at 7 o'clock. Habit had trained his body long before marriage ever entered his life. He sat upright slowly beneath heavy linen sheets and reached automatically toward the untouched side of the bed beside him. Cold. His hand remained there a second longer than necessary. Then he rose without comment and crossed toward the dressing room windows overlooking the eastern grounds. Morning mist still clung to the lake below the cliffs. A groom led horses across the lower courtyard. Somewhere downstairs, servants had already begun lighting fires for breakfast. Everything appeared normal. Lucien dressed quickly. Dark trousers, white shirt, black waistcoat. His movements remained precise despite the lingering exhaustion behind his eyes. The conversation with Vivian the previous night returned briefly to him, while he fastened his cufflinks. He frowned faintly. The memory felt unpleasant now for reasons he could not entirely explain. Vivian had always been effortless company. Beautiful. Clever enough to entertain him without demanding emotional labor in return. There had been a time before his marriage, when London assumed he would propose to her eventually. Sometimes Lucien himself had assumed it. Then Cecilia entered his life quietly and altered the shape of his future without seeming to realize she had done so. Strange. He had not thought about that in years. He descended toward breakfast at 7:30. The dining room stood warm beneath morning light spilling through tall windows. Silver trays gleamed against white linen. Coffee steamed near the center of the long table. Cecilia's seat remained empty. Lucien glanced toward it once while unfolding his newspaper. "Her Grace has not come down yet?" he asked absently. The butler, Hargrove, hesitated almost imperceptibly near the doorway. "No, Your Grace." Lucien nodded and returned his attention to the paper. Cecilia often rose early to review correspondence in her private sitting room. There was nothing unusual in that. Still, after several minutes, he realized the tea placed beside her untouched plate had already begun cooling. He lowered the newspaper slightly. "Send someone to ask whether she intends breakfast." "Yes, Your Grace." Hargrove disappeared silently from the room. Lucien took one sip of coffee and reached for the financial reports waiting near his right hand. 2 minutes later the butler returned. There was something subtly altered in the older man's posture now. Not alarm exactly. Tension. "Your Grace." Lucien looked up. "Well, Her Grace is not in her chambers." Lucien's expression did not change immediately. "Where is she?" "The maids believe she may have gone walking at first. However," Hargrove paused carefully, "several personal belongings appear to be missing." Silence settled across the dining room. Lucien lowered the papers fully this time. "Missing? Travel clothing, Your Grace." A trunk was removed from the east entrance shortly before dawn. Lucien stared at him for one long second. Then he rose abruptly enough that the chair legs scraped across marble floors. "Who authorized that?" "No one claims responsibility." Lucien crossed the room immediately without touching breakfast again. Hargrove followed several steps behind while servants lowered their eyes and stepped aside along the corridor. The east wing felt colder than usual. Lucien noticed that first. The fireplace outside Cecilia's sitting room had burned nearly out. No fresh flowers stood beside the windows this morning. Small absences. Yet the hallway already felt wrong somehow. He entered Cecilia's chambers without knocking. The room greeted him with stillness. Curtains partially open. Empty tea tray untouched beside the sofa. Wardrobe doors standing slightly ajar. Then his eyes found the writing desk near the window. Lucien stopped moving. The gold wedding band rested beside a single white card at the center of the polished wood. He crossed the room slowly now. Not hurried anymore. Almost cautious. As though approaching something dangerous enough to alter the shape of his life if touched directly. The card contained only 4 words. "Now you are free." Lucien read the sentence twice. The room remained silent except for distant wind against the windows overlooking the lake. His expression revealed almost nothing. Yet something faint tightened beneath the surface of it. Irritation perhaps. Confusion. Cecilia had never behaved dramatically before. Never once in 3 years. She disliked scenes. Disliked emotional displays. That restraint had always made their marriage easier. Predictable. Controlled. Lucien picked up the wedding ring carefully between 2 fingers. It still carried warmth from the room. His gaze shifted slowly across Cecilia's chambers. 1 trunk missing. Jewelry untouched except for what belonged personally to her family. The fire recently tended before dying low again. Then he noticed something else. Her brush was gone from the vanity. Cecilia never traveled without that silver brush. A strange detail to recognize immediately. Stranger still that he did. Hargrove remained near the doorway. "Should I send riders after the carriage, Your Grace?" Lucien continued staring at the note. No, the answer came too quickly. He set the ring back onto the desk with controlled precision. "She will return once she calms herself." Hargrove said nothing. Lucien moved toward the window overlooking the cliffs. The lake stretched dark and endless beneath the pale morning sky. Somewhere beyond those roads, Cecilia traveled farther away from Blackmere House with every passing minute. Yet Lucien felt oddly certain she could not truly leave him. Not Cecilia. She had built her entire life around this house. Around duty. Around him. "Your Grace," Hargrove said carefully. Her Grace left without personal attendance. Lucian kept his gaze fixed beyond the glass. Then ensure proper arrangements are prepared for her return. Yes, Your Grace. The butler withdrew silently. Lucian remained alone inside the room several moments longer. Something unsettled brushed against the edge of his thoughts. Not grief. Certainly not panic. More like absence entering a familiar room before anyone notices the temperature has changed. His eyes drifted once more toward the abandoned ring on the desk, then toward the empty chair beside the fireplace where Cecilia usually sat every evening, while reviewing household correspondence beneath candlelight. Strange. The room looked larger without her in it. By noon, Blackmere House had begun to notice her absence in ways no one could properly explain. Not loudly. Not immediately. The disruption moved quietly through the estate like cold air beneath a closed door. Lucian first recognized it in the library. He entered shortly after 11 carrying correspondence from London that required signatures before the evening courier departed. Usually, Cecilia organized the documents before breakfast. Parliamentary letters to the left. Estate accounts stacked separately beside the ink tray. Invitations requiring formal responses tied with cream ribbon. Everything ordered with such invisible efficiency that Lucian had long mistaken it for natural order rather than labor performed daily by another human being. This morning nothing sat where it belonged. The ledgers remained unopened beside the window. 2 invitations had gone unanswered for nearly a week. A letter from the Treasury regarding shipping tariffs had somehow been mixed with household expenses from Kent. Lucian stared briefly at the disorder before setting the papers down harder than necessary. Where is Mr. Holloway? Hargrove appeared almost instantly near the doorway. The steward is inspecting the lower stables, Your Grace. Send him here. The butler inclined his head and disappeared. Lucian removed his gloves slowly while scanning the room again. Cecilia usually opened the curtains before sunrise because she claimed dark rooms encouraged headaches. Today the heavy velvet drapes remained partially closed, leaving the library dim despite the late morning sun beyond the windows. Strange. The entire house felt darker somehow. Lucian crossed toward the fireplace and stopped beside Cecilia's chair. A book still rested on the small table beside it. Poetry. She often read while waiting for him in the evenings, though he could not remember the last time he actually asked what she was reading. His fingers brushed absent-mindedly across the chair's embroidered armrest. Then he stepped away immediately, irritated by the sudden sense that the room had become occupied by memory rather than furniture. Mr. Holloway arrived several minutes later carrying estate reports beneath one arm. The steward froze almost imperceptibly when he noticed Lucian's expression. Your Grace. The quarterly tenant accounts were meant to be finalized yesterday. Holloway blinked once. Her Grace usually reviews the final numbers before presentation. Lucian's jaw tightened faintly. Then review them yourself. Yes, Your Grace. Of course. Silence followed. Awkward. Holloway shifted the papers slightly against his chest before speaking again with visible caution. There is also the matter of tonight's dinner with the Ashfords. Lucian looked up sharply. What matter? The menu arrangements. Floral selections. Seating assignments. Holloway hesitated. Her Grace personally oversees formal dinners. Lucian stared at him for one long second, then another. Surely my household can survive one evening without requiring my wife to arrange flowers. Certainly, Your Grace. Holloway lowered his eyes immediately. Yet something uncomfortable remained hanging in the room after the steward left. Lucian returned to the desk and attempted to continue reviewing correspondence. 10 minutes later he realized he had read the same sentence 4 times without understanding it. Downstairs, the kitchens had become unusually tense by early afternoon. Cecilia always reviewed weekly supply orders every Wednesday before noon. Without her notes, the cook discovered 3 separate shipments had not been approved for the weekend gathering at Blackmere. The pastry chef argued quietly with the housekeeper near the pantry regarding guest preferences nobody else remembered accurately. One maid burst briefly into tears after accidentally placing white roses in the western drawing room instead of the pale autumn arrangements Cecilia preferred during October. It matters, Mrs. Pembroke snapped under her breath while correcting the display herself. Her Grace notices details. The younger maid swallowed quickly. Will she return before supper? No one answered immediately. Above them, footsteps crossed the entrance hall with sharp, controlled rhythm. Lucien. Conversation stopped at once. The Duke moved through the house with increasing impatience as the day continued. Not panic. Certainly not concern. Something more difficult to define. Friction, perhaps. The sensation of encountering resistance where there should have been none. At 2 o'clock he discovered the West study had not been prepared for his meeting with solicitors from London. At 3, the carriage schedule for Saturday's charity event had somehow disappeared entirely. By 4, one of the footmen informed him the wine delivery for the Ashford dinner had never been confirmed because Her Grace traditionally handled formal guest inventories personally. Lucien listened in silence while standing near the grand staircase. Then finally asked, "Did no one in this house function before my wife arrived?" The footman went pale instantly. "I did not mean." "No," Lucien cut him off quietly. "Clearly you did." The young man lowered his eyes at once and retreated. Lucien remained standing there several moments longer. Sunlight faded slowly across the entrance hall marble, turning the enormous room cold shades of gray and gold. Cecilia usually placed fresh flowers beside the staircase every Thursday afternoon. He noticed their absence now with irrational clarity. Empty silver vases stood near the windows untouched. The realization irritated him further. He turned abruptly toward the west corridor just as laughter drifted faintly from the drawing room nearby. "Vivian." Lucien closed his eyes briefly before entering. Vivian Whitmore stood beside the fireplace wearing soft cream silk that reflected candlelight against her golden hair. Beautiful as always. Effortless as always. 2 ladies from neighboring estates sat nearby listening while she recounted some amusing story from the previous London season. The room brightened around her naturally. Vivian noticed Lucien immediately and smiled. "There you are." Lucien inclined his head politely. "Miss Whitmore." One of the women laughed softly. "We were just saying Blackmere House feels unusually solemn today." Vivian glanced toward Lucien again, curiosity flickering behind her smile. "Has Cecilia still not come downstairs?" Silence touched the room briefly. Lucien answered evenly. "My wife left the estate this morning." Both women blinked in visible surprise. Vivian straightened slightly near the fireplace. "Left. Temporarily." The correction arrived instantly. Controlled. Final. One of the ladies exchanged a quick glance with the other before reaching for her teacup. Society smelled scandal the way wolves smelled blood beneath snow. Vivian recovered first. "Did she visit your aunt in Hampshire?" "I did not ask." Something shifted subtly in her expression then. Not guilt exactly. Awareness. She studied Lucien carefully for several seconds before dismissing the guests earlier than planned. Once the women departed, silence settled across the drawing room. Firelight flickered softly against the walls. Vivian approached slowly. "Lucien." He remained standing near the doorway. "What? What happened?" "Nothing happened." She held his gaze steadily. "Cecilia does not leave without explanation." "Apparently she does." Vivian folded her arms lightly across herself. "Did you argue?" Lucien almost answered immediately, then stopped. Memory returned without warning. The library. Firelight. Cecilia standing unseen outside the partially open door while he spoke carelessly into the night. For the first time all day, something cold moved beneath his ribs. Vivian noticed the silence at once. "Lucien." His expression hardened instantly. "This does not concern you." "She is my sister." "Then perhaps you should know where she went." Vivian stared at him another second before looking away toward the fire. "No," she said quietly. "I think perhaps she did not want anyone to know." The room fell silent again. Outside, evening shadows stretched slowly across the cliffs beyond Blackmere Lake while somewhere far north, Cecilia Whitmore sat alone inside a roadside and beside a narrow harbor town where no one knew the Duchess of Blackmere had vanished before sunrise, and for the first time in years, no one expected her to return home before dark. Cecilia woke just before dawn to the sound of gulls outside her window. For one disoriented second, she did not recognize the room around her. The ceiling slanted slightly overhead beneath dark wooden beams weathered by salt air. Thin morning light slipped through pale linen curtains stirred gently by the wind coming off the harbor. Somewhere below, Footsteps crossed old floorboards, followed by the distant clatter of dishes from the inn kitchen downstairs. Then memory returned all at once. Blackmere House. The library. Lucian's voice in the dark. Cecilia closed her eyes briefly and pressed one hand against the blanket near her waist until the sudden ache beneath her ribs settled enough to breathe through. The room smelled faintly of seawater and cedar smoke. Smaller than any chamber she had occupied in years. Simpler too. No velvet draperies. No polished marble fireplace. No servants waiting outside the door before sunrise. Just one narrow bed beside a rain-streaked window overlooking the northern harbor town of Greyhaven. She sat up slowly and reached for the wool robe folded across the chair beside her bed. Her muscles ached from yesterday's journey. The sea air carried sharp cold through the glass despite the small fire still glowing low in the hearth. Cecilia crossed toward the window and pulled the curtain aside carefully. Greyhaven stretched quietly beneath the pale October sky. Fishing boats rocked gently against the docks below while early morning fog drifted across the harbor in silver ribbons. Men in thick coats unloaded crates from a larger vessel near the eastern pier. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Ordinary life continued with no knowledge whatsoever that the Duchess of Blackmere stood barefoot beside an upstairs window trying to remember how to exist outside a marriage she had spent 3 years surviving. The realization should have terrified her more than it did. Instead she felt strangely hollow. Not relieved. Not broken. Merely absent from herself somehow. Like a woman who had stepped out of a portrait and left the painted version behind. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Miss Whitmore. Cecilia turned immediately. Mrs. Alden, the innkeeper's wife, entered carrying a small breakfast tray balanced carefully in both hands. The older woman smiled warmly beneath wisps of gray hair escaping her bun. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No. Thank you." Mrs. Alden set the tray near the fire. Fresh bread. Tea. 2 soft-boiled eggs. The simple kindness of it nearly undid Cecilia more than any cruelty had. "The harbor's calmer this morning," the woman continued while adjusting the teapot. "Storm moved east during the night." Cecilia nodded faintly. "I heard the gulls. They scream louder before clear weather." Mrs. Alden glanced toward her then hesitated slightly. "Will your husband be joining you later?" Cecilia looked down at the steaming tea. "No," the answer came quietly. Final enough that the older woman asked nothing further. Instead she adjusted the blanket near the chair with motherly precision before moving toward the door. "If you need anything, just ring downstairs. Greyhaven can feel lonely for newcomers." After she left, Cecilia remained standing beside the breakfast tray several moments without touching it. Lonely. Strange word. Blackmere House had contained over 40 rooms, dozens of servants, constant dinners and social obligations. Yet loneliness there had become so familiar she no longer recognized it as suffering. Here, inside one small room above a harbor inn, solitude at least felt honest. Back at Blackmere House, Lucian had not slept well. By the second evening of Cecilia's absence, the estate had begun unraveling in increasingly visible ways. Dinner with the Ashfords became a quiet disaster despite every servant's attempt to prevent it. One guest suffered allergies from the floral arrangements Cecilia normally screened personally. The second course arrived nearly 30 minutes late after confusion in the kitchens regarding wine pairings. Lord Ashford's wife remarked twice upon the unusual atmosphere inside the house. "Everything feels so solemn lately," she observed delicately while stirring untouched soup. Lucian barely responded. He sat at the head of the table listening to conversation drift around him without absorbing any of it. Cecilia's empty chair remained directly across from him beneath candlelight. No one acknowledged it openly. That somehow made it worse. Halfway through dinner, he realized no one had laughed naturally once all evening. After the guests departed, Lucian retreated immediately to his study carrying untouched brandy in one hand. Rain struck the tall windows again outside while firelight flickered low against shelves lined with leather-bound books. He loosened his collar impatiently and crossed toward the desk. Cecilia usually left the next morning's schedule arranged neatly there before retiring each night. Meetings, correspondence requiring signatures, guest reminders, charity appointments. Tonight the desk sat bare except for scattered papers no one had organized properly since she left. Lucian poured the brandy without drinking it. then set the glass down untouched beside the fireplace. Hargrove entered moments later carrying several letters. These arrived from London, Your Grace. Lucian accepted them absently. Any word from my wife? No, Your Grace. Silence settled heavily between them. Hargrove remained standing near the doorway longer than usual. Finally he spoke carefully. Mrs. Pembroke requested guidance regarding Saturday's Orphan Fund Gala. Lucian closed his eyes briefly. What guidance? Her Grace traditionally oversees the annual arrangements herself. Of course she did. Lucian exhaled slowly through his nose. Tell Mrs. Pembroke to proceed however she sees fit. Hargrove inclined his head. Yet before leaving, the older man hesitated again. If I may speak freely, Your Grace. Lucian looked up. Briefly. The staff is concerned. About what? About Her Grace. Lucian's expression hardened instantly. My wife left of her own choosing. She is not a kidnapped child. No, Your Grace. Hargrove lowered his gaze respectfully. But this house has not functioned properly without her. The words landed harder than intended. Lucian stared at the butler several seconds without answering. Then finally said quietly, You are dismissed. Hargrove withdrew at once. Lucian remained alone beside the fire listening to rain against the windows. Not function properly. Ridiculous. Blackmere House existed centuries before Cecilia Whitmore entered it. The Ravenscroft estate employed over 60 servants, 3 estate managers, and enough wealth to maintain itself indefinitely. Yet sometime after midnight, Lucian found himself standing outside Cecilia's chambers again without consciously deciding to walk there. The hallway remained dark except for one candle burning low beside the staircase. He entered slowly. Everything looked precisely as she left it. The scent of lavender lingered faintly near the vanity. One book remained open beside the sofa where she often read before sleep. Lucian crossed toward it automatically. Poetry again. He frowned slightly at the marked page before reading the line beneath her ribbon bookmark. Some absences arrive before the person has gone. Lucian closed the book immediately. Irritation flickered beneath his ribs again. Cecilia always favored melancholy writers. He moved toward the fireplace instead and stopped near the mantel where her wedding portrait still hung above the room. Candlelight softened her painted expression. Quiet eyes. Calm posture. The artist had captured her exactly as society preferred her. Elegant. Controlled. Easy to overlook beside brighter women. Lucian stared at the portrait longer than intended, then suddenly remembered something small. The first winter after their marriage, Cecilia once waited nearly 3 hours beside the ballroom entrance because a snowstorm delayed his carriage returning from London. She never complained afterward, merely took his frozen gloves from his hands and asked whether he had eaten supper. At the time, Lucian considered the moment ordinary. Now the memory returned with unsettling sharpness. He frowned harder. Why this memory? Why now? Down in Greyhaven, Cecilia spent her second evening walking slowly along the harbor after sunset wrapped tightly in her dark wool coat. Cold wind swept across the docks carrying the scent of salt water and approaching rain. Lanterns glowed warmly inside small storefronts lining the narrow streets. Fishermen laughed somewhere near the tavern at the edge of town. No one recognized her. No one bowed. No one called her Your Grace. She should have felt invisible. Instead she felt human for the first time in months. Cecilia paused beside the pier railing and watched dark waves strike wooden posts beneath the fading sky. The sea looked endless tonight. Restless. Alive in ways Blackmere Lake had never been. A young couple passed nearby carrying bundled nets between them. The woman laughed softly after slipping on wet boards. Her husband steadied her instinctively with one arm around her waist before continuing down the pier together. Cecilia looked away almost immediately. Strange. She no longer knew whether she envied love itself or merely the ease of being wanted openly. The harbor bell rang once through the evening mist. Cecilia pulled her coat tighter and started walking again while somewhere many miles south, Lucian Ravenscroft stood alone inside his wife's empty chambers, realizing with slow-growing unease that silence could become louder than any argument once the person creating warmth inside a house finally disappeared from it. On the 4th morning of Cecilia's absence, Blackmere House woke to its first genuine scandal. The problem began with flowers. 37 arrangements meant for the Orphan Fund Gala arrived at the estate shortly after 8 o'clock. Every single one was wrong. Cecilia always ordered pale autumn roses for charity events because several benefactors considered white lilies inappropriate for evenings connected to children's memorial funds. This year no one remembered. By breakfast, the main ballroom smelled overwhelmingly of funeral arrangements. Mrs. Pembroke nearly burst into tears in the center of the West Hall while directing frantic servants to remove the displays before guests arrived. "Take them out," she whispered sharply. "All of them. Before His Grace sees." Unfortunately, Lucien already had. He stood near the ballroom entrance watching footmen carry armfuls of white lilies back through the corridors while petals scattered across polished marble floors like pieces of some invisible surrender. What exactly is happening? Mrs. Pembroke turned immediately pale. "A misunderstanding with the florist, Your Grace." Lucien's gaze moved slowly across the room. Empty tables. Half-finished decorations. Musicians still lacking final instructions because Cecilia traditionally approved seating arrangements herself before noon. Nothing appeared finished. Nothing appeared calm. "The gala begins in 6 hours. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then why does my ballroom resemble a burial service?" The housekeeper swallowed carefully. "Her Grace usually handles the final preparations personally." There it was again. That sentence. Variations of it had haunted the estate for days now. "Her Grace usually handles this. Her Grace normally remembers that. Her Grace always notices." Lucien felt irritation rise instantly beneath his skin. Surely one woman cannot be solely responsible for maintaining an entire ducal estate. No one answered. Because suddenly the evidence stood all around him in silence and wilted flowers. Lucien looked away first. "Fix it," he said flatly before turning toward the corridor. Yet as he walked back through Blackmere House, something deeply uncomfortable followed him. Not guilt. Not yet. Awareness, perhaps. The unsettling realization that Cecilia's labor had been so constant, so precise, and so invisible that everyone only recognized its scale once it vanished entirely. Upstairs, Vivian Whitmore watched the chaos from the second-floor balcony overlooking the ballroom below. She wore pale green silk this morning, elegant enough for breakfast guests arriving later that afternoon. Her golden hair remained pinned loosely at the nape of her neck in soft curls society adored instantly. For years, people described the Whitmore sisters as opposites. Vivian entered rooms like sunlight. Cecilia entered them like air. One was noticed immediately. The other became necessary slowly. Vivian rested both hands lightly against the railing, while servants rushed below carrying replacement flowers through the halls. Then she noticed Lucien crossing the lower corridor alone. His shoulders looked tighter than usual. His expression harder. She descended quietly before intercepting him near the west staircase. "You look exhausted." Lucien stopped without visible surprise. "The house is disorganized." Vivian almost smiled. That is a very polite way of describing catastrophe. He did not answer immediately. "The gala will proceed." "Of course it will." She studied him carefully another moment. "You still think she is coming back soon?" "She is my wife." "That is not an answer." Lucien's gaze shifted toward the ballroom where servants continued rearranging tables below. "Cecilia dislikes disorder. She will not remain away indefinitely." Vivian looked at him with an expression he could not immediately identify. Pity perhaps. Or disbelief. "You really do not understand her at all." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning?" Vivian folded her gloves together slowly. Cecilia spent most of her life enduring unhappiness quietly because she believed love required patience. Her voice softened faintly. If she finally left without explanation, then something inside her must have ended completely. Lucien's jaw tightened. "You assume too much." "No." Vivian looked toward the ballroom below. "I think all of us assume too little." Silence stretched briefly between them. Then Lucien spoke before thinking fully through the question. "Did she ever mention being unhappy?" Vivian turned back toward him slowly. Genuine surprise flickered across her face now. "You never noticed?" The answer irritated him immediately because he did not have one. Before he could respond, a young maid hurried anxiously toward them carrying folded guest lists. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke's secretary, "has arrived early, and says the seating arrangements are incorrect. Lucien closed his eyes briefly. Vivian watched him another second before stepping aside. "Good luck," she said softly. By late afternoon, rain clouds gathered again over Blackmere Lake. The gala proceeded anyway. Nobility always preferred elegance over weather. Carriages lined the front drive beneath lantern light while servants rushed through the entrance hall removing damp cloaks and announcing titles with rehearsed precision. Lucien stood near the ballroom doors greeting guests beside an empty space where Cecilia normally waited. That absence became impossible to ignore after the third inquiry. "The Duchess is unwell? Visiting relatives? How unfortunate she could not attend." Lucien answered each question with controlled politeness. "Temporary travel. Family matters. Nothing serious." Yet whispers still moved through the ballroom like silk brushing against marble. Society adored two things above all else: beauty and disappearance. Tonight Blackmere House offered both. Lucien endured the evening with increasing strain hidden carefully beneath perfect aristocratic composure. One lord received the wrong title placement at dinner. Two donors complained quietly about altered seating assignments. A visiting duchess requested Cecilia specifically regarding the orphan fund accounts because the duchess always remembers every detail. Lucien drank more whiskey than usual and still remained painfully sober. Near midnight, he finally escaped the ballroom long enough to breathe alone in the west corridor overlooking the cliffs. Rain struck the windows hard now. Candlelight trembled softly across dark glass. Behind him, distant music drifted through the estate while laughter rose and faded beneath crystal chandeliers. Cecilia had once supervised cleaning personally every autumn before gala season. Lucien loosened his collar slightly. For the first time in years, exhaustion settled visibly into his posture. "You look miserable." He turned sharply. Vivian stood several feet away near the staircase holding two untouched champagne glasses. She crossed toward him calmly and offered one. Lucien ignored it. "I am hosting 300 guests." "Yes," she said softly. "Alone." Something about the word irritated him again because it sounded too accurate. Vivian set both glasses untouched beside the window ledge. "Do you know what Cecilia told me the night before your wedding?" Lucien looked back toward the storm outside. "I assume you intend to tell me regardless." "She said she did not mind if you never loved her." Silence. "She only hoped you would eventually choose her willingly." Lucien stared out at the rain several seconds longer, then finally said quietly, "I never treated her cruelly." Vivian's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Sadness now. "No," she agreed softly. "That was probably the problem." He turned toward her sharply. "Explain yourself." "Cruelty leaves bruises people can point to." Vivian folded her arms lightly against the cold. "Indifference leaves people questioning whether they imagined the loneliness at all." The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Lucien said nothing. Yet somewhere deep beneath his ribs, discomfort began shifting slowly into something harder to ignore. Not grief yet. Not regret. Recognition, perhaps. The dangerous beginning of it. Later that same night, Cecilia sat alone beside the harbor in Greyhaven wrapped beneath a thick wool blanket, while watching storm waves strike against the pier below. Mrs. Alden had insisted she take the heavier blanket after noticing how long she spent outdoors each evening. "Sea wind gets into the bones if you let it," the innkeeper warned gently. Cecilia smiled faintly at the memory now. No one at Blackmere House had noticed whether she felt cold in years. A lighthouse beam swept slowly across the dark water beyond the harbor. Boats rocked against their ropes below while rain moved toward shore in distant gray curtains. Cecilia held a cup of tea between both hands, letting the warmth settle against her palms. She should have felt devastated still. Instead she mostly felt tired. Tired in the deep quiet way people become after carrying emotional loneliness, so long they mistake it for personality. Footsteps approached softly behind her along the dock. "You are outside every evening." Cecilia turned slightly. Elias Mercer stood several feet away holding a lantern against the rain. The harbor carpenter. 32 years old perhaps. Broad shoulders. Kind gray eyes weathered by sea wind and difficult winters. Mrs. Alden introduced them briefly the previous afternoon when Elias repaired a damaged stair rail inside the inn. Cecilia had barely spoken 6 words to him since. The harbor helps me think, she answered quietly. He glanced toward the rough water. Dangerous place for that. A faint smile touched her mouth before disappearing again. Elias noticed anyway. Storm will worsen within the hour, he said gently. You should head inside soon. Cecilia nodded. Yet neither moved immediately. Wind swept rain against the docks while somewhere far south inside Blackmere House, Lucian Ravenscroft stood motionless beside a ballroom window, realizing with growing unease that he could no longer remember the last time his wife smiled freely in his presence, and the memory of not noticing it sooner had begun haunting him more than her absence itself. The letter arrived at Blackmere House 3 days later beneath gray afternoon skies and steady rain. Lucian noticed it immediately because Cecilia's handwriting appeared nowhere on the envelope. The cream stationery bore the seal of Whitmore Manor instead. He stood beside the library fireplace while Hargrove placed the correspondence tray carefully across the desk. This came by private courier, Your Grace. Lucian picked up the letter without speaking. For one brief irrational second, relief moved through him before he opened it. Cecilia's father had written only 6 lines. Lucian read them twice anyway. Your Grace, Cecilia has not returned to Whitmore Manor, nor has she contacted the family directly. Vivian informs us there may have been disagreement within your household before her departure. If you possess knowledge of my daughter's whereabouts, I expect immediate correspondence. My wife is deeply distressed. Arthur Whitmore. Lucian lowered the letter slowly. Rain tapped against the windows behind him. The fire crackled low beside the shelves. Somewhere downstairs, servants prepared the house for another evening of guests neither he nor Cecilia would have wanted to entertain. She did not return home, he said quietly. Hargrove remained still near the doorway. No, Your Grace. Lucian looked again at Arthur Whitmore's handwriting. Deeply distressed. Strange. The phrase unsettled him more than accusation would have. Cecilia's mother rarely expressed emotion publicly. The thought of that reserved woman worrying herself sick somewhere south of London disturbed him unexpectedly. He folded the letter once and placed it carefully beside the untouched whiskey near his desk. Send riders north and west, he ordered finally. Quietly. Hargrove blinked once. You wish the search expanded? Lucian's jaw tightened slightly at the word search. Until now, he had avoided using it even privately. Cecilia was not lost. She was angry. Temporary. Returning eventually. Yet beneath those thoughts something colder had begun growing over the past week. A question he could no longer silence. What if she meant it this time? Yes, he answered flatly. Discreet inquiries only. No gossip. Of course, Your Grace. After the butler left, Lucian remained motionless several moments beside the fire. Then, without fully understanding why, he crossed toward Cecilia's writing desk again. He had begun doing that often lately. Standing inside her chambers, touching objects she once used casually, searching for something he could not properly name. Today his attention settled on the lowest drawer near the window. Locked. Lucian frowned faintly. Cecilia rarely locked anything. He tried the handle once more before retrieving the small brass key ring she always kept hidden beneath the blotter tray. Of course he knew where she hid it. The realization irritated him instantly. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside rested neatly stacked correspondence tied with pale blue ribbon. More letters. Lucian stared down at them silently. Not addressed. Not sealed. The first page on top carried Cecilia's handwriting dated nearly 2 years earlier. Slowly he picked it up. Lucian, today you asked whether the roses near the West Terrace bloom naturally this late into autumn. I told you yes because it seemed easier than explaining I have spent 6 weeks covering them against frost every evening after supper, so you would still have color outside your study windows when Parliament keeps you awake past midnight. Lucian stopped reading. Something shifted sharply beneath his ribs. He looked down at the remaining stack. Dozens of pages. Some folded carefully. Others unfinished. All written in Cecilia's elegant, quiet hand. He sat slowly in the chair beside the desk before reading another. Lucian, I think there are marriages built from affection and marriages built from endurance. Sometimes I cannot tell which one ours became. Another. Today you thank the butler for arranging your travel schedule. I smiled because Hargrove looked embarrassed accepting credit for work I completed at 3 in the morning while you slept beside me. Another. I do not mind being unloved nearly as much as I mind becoming invisible beside the person I chose most carefully. Lucian lowered the page abruptly. The room had become too quiet. Rain continued softly beyond the windows overlooking the cliffs. Downstairs, faint music drifted from the drawing room where guests gathered before dinner. Yet inside Cecilia's chambers, silence pressed against him with growing weight. Invisible. The word remained lodged somewhere beneath his thoughts now. He stared toward the empty fireplace several seconds before standing abruptly and crossing toward the window. Outside, the lake stretched dark beneath the storm clouds while cold wind bent the trees along the cliffs. Lucian rested one hand against the glass. He remembered suddenly how Cecilia used to wait for him there during winter storms whenever his carriage returned late from London. Always beside the same window. Always pretending she had simply been reading nearby rather than watching for headlights through the rain. He had noticed that. Of course he had noticed. Then why had he never said anything? The question unsettled him enough that he stepped back immediately. Behind him, the unfinished letters remained scattered across the desk like evidence from a trial no one warned him he was losing. That evening, Vivian found him alone in the library long after dinner ended. Candlelight flickered across the dark wood shelves while untouched brandy sat beside his elbow. Lucian had removed his coat hours earlier. The top button of his collar remained undone. Small signs of disorder on a man usually constructed entirely from control. Vivian stopped near the doorway after noticing the pages spread across the desk. You found them. Lucian looked up sharply. You knew these existed? Cecilia showed me one once. Vivian crossed slowly toward the fire. She never intended you to read them. His expression hardened slightly. Then why write them? Because some people speak only when they believe no one is listening. Silence settled briefly. Vivian reached toward one folded page near the desk before recognizing Cecilia's handwriting immediately. Her eyes softened almost painfully. God. Lucian watched her carefully now. You knew she was unhappy. I knew she was lonely. There is a difference. Vivian looked at him directly then. For Cecilia? No. The answer landed harder than accusation. Lucian leaned back slowly in the chair beside the desk. Fatigue had begun settling into his face visibly these past few days. Not physical exhaustion alone. Something deeper. Like a man slowly discovering entire sections of his own life had occurred without his full attention. I never intended to hurt her, he said quietly after a long silence. Vivian's expression changed. Not angry now. Sad again. That may be true. She glanced toward the scattered letters. But intention matters very little to someone who spends years feeling unseen. Lucian said nothing. Because somewhere deep beneath all his certainty, the truth had already begun taking shape. Cecilia never demanded affection loudly because she feared losing even the small pieces of tenderness she occasionally received. God. He had mistaken her silence for contentment. Later that night, after Vivian retired upstairs, Lucian remained alone in the library reading every unfinished letter Cecilia left behind. Hours passed unnoticed. Candle flames burned lower. Rain faded beyond the windows. Each page revealed another invisible kindness he barely remembered receiving. The winter scarves replaced before he noticed they had worn thin. The estate debts quietly reorganized after his cousin's failed investments nearly damaged Blackmere finances. The political dinner guests strategically seated beside allies before parliamentary votes. The rose garden restored because his mother once loved it before illness consumed her final years. Cecilia had known all of this, remembered all of this, protected all of this, while believing herself unloved. Around 2 in the morning, Lucian finally stopped reading. One unfinished page rested alone beneath his hand. The final sentence ended abruptly mid-thought. Sometimes I think if I disappeared tomorrow, the house itself would continue breathing exactly the same way. Lucian stared at the line for a very long time, then slowly closed his eyes. Because for the first time since Cecilia vanished, he realized the horrifying truth. Blackmere House had not breathed properly once since she left it. Hundreds of miles north in Greyhaven, Cecilia stood beneath the harbor lanterns watching fishing boats return through thick evening fog, while Elias Mercer secured ropes along the pier below. Wind carried salt spray lightly against her face. She pulled the wool coat tighter around herself and listened to the harbor sounds surrounding her. Gulls, waves, men calling across dark water. Life continuing without elegance or titles or carefully controlled emotional starvation. Elias glanced up from the dock and noticed her standing there again. "You always look like you're listening for something." Cecilia blinked slightly at the observation. "Do I? Most people watch the sea." He tied another knot carefully against the wooden post. "You watch like you're waiting for it to answer you back." Cecilia looked toward the dark horizon beyond the harbor lights. For a moment she almost smiled. "And does it?" Elias considered her quietly before answering. "Not always." He straightened slowly beneath the lantern glow. "But sometimes it reminds people they're still alive." The words settled unexpectedly deep inside her chest. Cecilia looked away quickly toward the waves before he could notice how close she suddenly came to crying. The first real clue arrived 11 days after Cecilia disappeared. Lucian received it during breakfast beneath a sky the color of steel. Hargrove entered the dining room carrying a small folded note instead of the usual correspondence tray. Something in the older man's expression immediately pulled Lucian from the financial reports spread untouched beside his coffee. "One of the riders returned from the northern coast, Your Grace." Lucian set the papers down at once. "And?" Hargrove crossed the room quietly before offering the note. "A woman matching Her Grace's description was seen in Greyhaven, approximately 1 week ago." Silence settled instantly across the breakfast room. Lucian unfolded the note carefully. The handwriting belonged to one of his estate riders. Dark-haired woman. Traveling alone. Staying above Alden's Harbor and near the northern docks. Uses maiden name. Lucian read the final line twice. Uses maiden name. Something about that detail struck deeper than expected. Not Duchess of Blackmere. Not Mrs. Ravenscroft. Cecilia Whitmore. As though she had cut herself cleanly from him the moment she stepped out of Blackmere House before sunrise. "Prepare the carriage," he said immediately. Hargrove hesitated. "You intend to travel personally?" Lucian looked up sharply. "Did I become incapable of locating my own wife while I slept?" "No, Your Grace." The butler lowered his gaze. "The roads north are difficult this time of year. Then we leave within the hour." After Hargrove withdrew, Lucian remained seated several moments longer staring down at the note in his hand. Greyhaven. A harbor town nearly 300 miles north along the coast. Small. Isolated. The sort of place Cecilia would choose precisely because no one there would recognize her title. He tried picturing her in such a town and failed initially. Cecilia belonged beside candlelit corridors and polished marble and soft classical music drifting through drawing rooms at midnight. Then another thought followed immediately after. No. She belonged nowhere near those things if they had slowly hollowed her out. Lucian stood abruptly. For the first time since her disappearance, urgency replaced denial completely. Upstairs, Vivian intercepted him near the west corridor as servants rushed to prepare travel arrangements below. "You found her." Lucian adjusted his gloves without slowing. "Possibly." Vivian followed him toward the staircase. "Where?" "Greyhaven." Something flickered across her expression then. Relief perhaps, followed quickly by concern. "And what exactly do you intend to do when you arrive?" Lucian stopped midway down the staircase and turned toward her. "Bring my wife home." Vivian held his gaze steadily. "You still think this is about location?" His jaw tightened slightly. "She left because of me." "Yes." Vivian's voice softened. "Which means simply standing in front of her again will not fix anything." Lucian looked away first. Because somewhere beneath all his certainty, he already feared she might be right. The journey north lasted nearly 2 days through cold rain and worsening coastal winds. Lucian spent most of the trip silent inside the carriage while Graymore cliffs and flooded fields rolled endlessly beyond the windows. He slept little, ate less. Each mile north seemed only to sharpen the strange tension growing steadily beneath his ribs. Anticipation mixed with dread. What if Cecilia refused to see him? Worse, what if she looked relieved not to? Near dusk on the second evening, the carriage finally descended the narrow road overlooking Greyhaven Harbor. Lucian stepped out into sharp salt air and immediate wind. The town spread below in clusters of weathered buildings pressed against dark water beneath a sky streaked silver and blue. Fishing lanterns flickered along the docks while gulls circled overhead through the mist. Nothing about Greyhaven resembled Cecilia's world at Blackmere House. Yet somehow Lucian understood instantly why she stayed. The harbor breathed differently, freely. No one here cared about titles or parliamentary alliances, or whether a duchess smiled properly during supper. People moved quickly through the streets carrying crates and ropes and lanterns. Alive in practical ways aristocratic society often forgot existed. Lucian stood silently beside the carriage while sea wind pulled sharply at his coat. Somewhere in this town, Cecilia had spent nearly 2 weeks rebuilding herself beyond his reach. The realization unsettled him more than expected. Alden's Harbor Inn sat near the eastern docks overlooking rough black water beneath the cliffs. Warm light glowed through the downstairs windows when Lucian entered shortly after nightfall. Conversation softened almost immediately around him. Men carrying fishing nets glanced up from the tables. A woman near the fire stopped stirring soup long enough to stare discreetly at the tall stranger dressed in expensive dark wool and controlled aristocratic authority. Lucian removed his gloves slowly. Mrs. Alden. The innkeeper emerged from behind the front counter wiping her hands against her apron. She stopped immediately after recognizing the quality of his clothes and posture. Sir, I am looking for Cecilia Whitmore. Silence. Small. Immediate. Mrs. Alden's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Protective now. And you are her husband. Something changed in the room then. Not loudly. Yet Lucian felt it. The subtle collective shift of strangers deciding whether a woman hiding among them requires defending. Mrs. Alden folded the towel carefully beside the counter before answering. Miss Whitmore did not mention expecting company. Lucian's jaw tightened slightly at the name. Miss Whitmore. I did not inform her I was coming. Clearly. The older woman studied him several seconds longer. You should know she seems peaceful here. The words landed harder than intended. Lucian looked briefly toward the harbor windows where rain streaked softly against the glass. Peaceful. He could not remember the last time anyone used that word regarding Cecilia at Blackmere House. I am not here to harm my wife. Mrs. Alden's expression softened slightly then. No, she glanced toward the staircase at the far end of the inn. I suspect you're here because you finally realized she was hurting. Lucian said nothing. Because the stranger had spoken with terrifying accuracy. Upstairs, Cecilia stood beside her narrow room window listening to distant harbor bells through the rain. She wore a simple dark blue dress tonight with her hair loosely pinned back from the sea wind earlier along the docks. The room behind her glowed warmly beneath candlelight. Smaller now than when she first arrived somehow. Familiar. Safe. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Alden's voice carried gently through the door. Cecilia crossed the room and opened it immediately. Then stopped. Something in the older woman's face changed the air around her before a single word was spoken. You have a visitor. Cecilia's fingers tightened unconsciously against the door frame. Who? Mrs. Alden hesitated only briefly. Your husband. Silence swallowed the room whole. Cecilia did not breathe for one terrible second. Then another. Downstairs, Lucian stood near the harbor windows watching storm waves strike against the docks while every heartbeat inside his chest seemed suddenly too loud. Upstairs, Cecilia closed her eyes briefly as the past 2 weeks collapsed inward all at once. The library. The letters. The silence. The loneliness she finally escaped. I told no one where I was. Mrs. Alden nodded gently. Seems he searched anyway. Cecilia looked toward the staircase beyond the hallway. Somewhere below, Lucian Ravenscroft waited only feet away for the first time since she disappeared before sunrise, carrying nothing with her except heartbreak and enough courage to finally leave the man she loved. Her hand trembled once against the doorframe before she stilled it immediately. Then quietly, almost to herself, she whispered, I do not know if I can survive seeing him again. Cecilia remained upstairs for nearly 10 minutes after Mrs. Alden left her alone. Long enough for the tea beside the fireplace to cool completely. Long enough for rain to soften against the harbor windows, and for her heartbeat to settle from panic into something quieter and more dangerous. Grief. She stood motionless beside the bed with both hands clasped tightly together while memories moved through her in sharp, unbearable fragments. Lucian standing at the top of the grand staircase the night she left. Lucian loosening his gloves beside the fire after returning from Parliament. Lucian whispering softly in the dark library about loving another woman. Strange how love could survive humiliation so stubbornly. Mrs. Alden knocked once more before opening the door slightly. "You don't have to see him tonight." Cecilia looked toward the older woman slowly. "If I do not, he will remain downstairs until morning." Mrs. Alden considered that briefly before nodding once. Probably true. Cecilia closed her eyes for a moment. Of course it was true. Lucian Ravenscroft did not abandon difficult things once he finally acknowledged they existed. The tragedy was that he acknowledged them too late. Where is he? Near the harbor windows. Cecilia inhaled carefully. All right. She changed nothing about her appearance before going downstairs. No jewelry. No carefully arranged curls. Just the simple dark blue dress she wore earlier along the docks and the wool cardigan Mrs. Alden insisted she borrow against the sea wind. Lucian had seen her draped in diamonds before Parliament in candlelight and orchestras. Tonight he would see what remained after loneliness stripped everything unnecessary away. The staircase creaked softly beneath her steps as she descended toward the first floor. Voices drifted faintly from the dining room near the back of the inn. Someone laughed near the kitchen. Rain tapped gently against the harbor windows beside the entrance. Ordinary sounds. Yet every step downward felt like walking back toward a life she barely escaped surviving. Lucian stood exactly where Mrs. Alden said he would, near the eastern windows overlooking dark water beyond the docks. His back remained turned toward the staircase when Cecilia reached the final step. He wore a black wool coat damp from rain and travel. One hand rested inside his pocket while the other held untouched whiskey near his side. Even from across the room, exhaustion had changed him visibly. His shoulders looked heavier somehow, less certain. Cecilia stopped moving immediately. For one terrible second neither spoke. Then Lucian turned. The silence that followed felt physical. Cecilia had imagined this moment repeatedly since leaving Blackmere House. Anger, accusation, coldness. Instead, what struck her first was the expression on his face after seeing her again. Relief. So sharp and immediate it nearly broke something inside her. Lucian stared at her without moving. Simplicity altered her more than distance ever could. No silk gowns. No diamonds against pale skin. No polished aristocratic perfection arranged carefully beside him at public events. Just Cecilia. Wind-touched hair loosely pinned back. Tired eyes. Thin shadows beneath them from nights spent sleeping alone in unfamiliar rooms. Human. God. He had forgotten how beautiful she became when she stopped trying to disappear politely beside him. You found me. Her voice came softer than intended. Lucian swallowed once before answering. Yes. Cecilia folded her arms lightly against herself. Why? The question landed between them with brutal clarity. Why had he come? Obligation? Pride? Reputation? Love? Lucian opened his mouth immediately, then stopped, because for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he realized honesty required more courage than control. I did not understand what losing you would feel like. Cecilia looked down briefly toward the floorboards. The answer hurt because it sounded sincere. That is not the same thing as loving me. Lucian's grip tightened slightly around the untouched glass. I know that now. Rain moved softly beyond the harbor windows. Somewhere outside, ropes struck gently against wooden masts in the wind. Cecilia studied him carefully across the dim inn parlor. The past 2 weeks had altered him too. Less polished now. The perfect emotional distance he once carried so effortlessly showed visible fractures around the edges. He looked like a man sleeping poorly inside a house suddenly too large for one person. My parents were worried, he said after a long silence. Cecilia almost smiled faintly at that. You searched for me because my parents were worried? No, the answer came instantly. Lucian stepped closer slowly. I searched because every room at Blackmere House became unbearable once you were gone. Cecilia's breath caught unexpectedly. He noticed immediately. Of course he did. That was the cruelest part perhaps. Lucian had always noticed more than she believed. He simply failed to understand the weight of what he saw. The house survived before me. Not like this. His voice lowered slightly. Nothing functions properly anymore. Cecilia looked away toward the harbor windows. Then hire better staff. Lucian almost flinched. Because beneath the quietness of her tone sat years of buried pain finally sharpened enough to wound back. Cecilia. No, she wrapped her arms tighter around herself now. Do not stand there speaking about flower arrangements and dinner schedules as though that is why I left. I know that is not why you left. Do you? Her eyes lifted to his then, bright now with restrained emotion. Because 2 weeks ago you believed I would return once I calmed myself. As though heartbreak were a tantrum. Lucian said nothing. Because it was true. The silence confirmed it more brutally than denial would have. Cecilia exhaled shakily before continuing. I spent 3 years convincing myself that patience could eventually become love if I waited quietly enough. Her voice softened dangerously. Then I heard my husband whisper affection to another woman in a tone he never once used with me. Lucian closed his eyes briefly. The memory struck him harder now than when it happened. Vivian was never. Please do not humiliate me further by explaining it. The word stopped him instantly. Cecilia looked toward the fire near the back wall instead of at him now. It does not matter whether you truly loved her. You loved someone else more easily than you ever loved me. Silence swallowed the room whole after that. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Lucian stared at her while realization settled deeper and deeper beneath his ribs. She believed herself difficult to love. God. Somehow during 3 years of marriage, he allowed the gentlest woman he ever knew to feel emotionally unbearable. I read your letters. Cecilia went perfectly still. Slowly she looked back toward him. What? The letters in your desk. Shame flickered visibly across her face then. Raw and immediate. You should not have read those. I know. Lucian stepped closer again. But I did. Cecilia's hands trembled once before tightening together harder. Then you know I never intended to burden you with them. Burden me. His voice roughened unexpectedly. Cecilia, you wrote pages convincing yourself your existence inconvenienced me. She laughed softly then. Not bitter. Worse. Tired. Did it not? Lucian stared at her across the dim harbor light. Then quietly, honestly, he answered the question he should have years earlier. No. Cecilia's eyes closed instantly at the sound of it. One word. Too late. Yet devastating anyway. She turned away sharply toward the windows before he could see tears gathering finally after weeks of careful control. Outside, waves crashed hard against the docks beneath the storm-dark sky. Lucian watched her shoulders rise unsteadily beneath the wool cardigan. For one terrible moment, instinct told him to cross the room and pull her into his arms. Yet another realization stopped him cold. He no longer possessed the right to comfort the pain he created. I do not know how to fix this, he admitted quietly. Cecilia stood very still with her back toward him. Neither do I. The honesty in her voice frightened him more than anger would have. Because anger still implied attachment. Exhaustion implied surrender. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly somewhere along the second floor. The inn continued breathing around them while two people who once shared a bed now stood several feet apart, unable to bridge years of silence with simple apologies. Finally, Cecilia wiped quickly beneath one eye before turning back toward him again. Her composure returned carefully. Fragile but present. You should return to Blackmere tomorrow. Lucian looked at her steadily. I am not leaving without you. Pain flickered briefly across her face at the certainty in his tone. You still think this is about where I sleep? Then tell me what it is about. Cecilia held his gaze for a very long time before answering. It is about spending years beside someone, and realizing they only notice your absence after you disappear. The words settled quietly into the room. Final enough that even Lucian could not answer immediately. Because somewhere deep inside himself, he knew with unbearable clarity that she was right. Lucian rented the small room beside the harbor staircase that same night. Cecilia learned this from Mrs. Alden the following morning when she came downstairs just after sunrise and found his coat hanging beside the entrance beside fishermen's jackets still damp from sea spray. For several silent seconds, Cecilia simply stared at it. Black wool. Tailored shoulders. London elegance standing awkwardly inside a coastal inn where men tracked saltwater across the floors without apology. He refused the larger room, Mrs. Alden explained quietly while pouring tea behind the counter. Said he only needed a bed and hot water. Cecilia removed her gloves slowly. That sounds unlike him. People change when they are afraid. The older woman said it casually, as though discussing weather instead of heartbreak. Cecilia looked toward the staircase instinctively. Lucian was awake already. She knew before hearing movement overhead. 3 years beside the same man taught a woman strange things. The rhythm of his footsteps. The silence he carried when troubled. The exact sound of exhaustion hidden beneath controlled breathing. You don't have to speak with him again today, Mrs. Alden added gently. Cecilia wrapped both hands around the warm teacup. Yes, she said softly after a moment. I think I do. Outside, Greyhaven Harbor moved beneath pale morning light and sharp coastal wind. Boats returned slowly through the mist while gulls circled above the docks crying against the waves. Cecilia stepped onto the pier shortly after breakfast wrapped tightly in her dark coat. She needed air before facing Lucian again. Needed distance from the dangerous softness that still appeared inside her chest whenever he looked at her too carefully. She hated that part most. The fact that love remained alive despite everything. Elias Mercer stood near the northern dock repairing storm damage to one of the wooden railings when he noticed her approaching. Morning. Cecilia nodded faintly. Good morning. He wiped rainwater from his hands with a cloth before glancing toward the inn behind her. Your husband arrived. The statement carried no judgment, only observation. Cecilia looked toward the harbor instead. Yes. Elias studied her quietly for a second. You look tired. A weak smile touched her mouth briefly. That also sounds like an observation. It is. He leaned one shoulder lightly against the railing post. You looked calmer before yesterday. Cecilia lowered her gaze to the dark water moving beneath the docks. Honesty rose before she could stop it. I do not know how to speak to him anymore. Elias remained silent long enough that she almost apologized for saying too much. Then finally he answered softly. Sometimes people spend so long hurting each other quietly that they forget how to talk without bleeding. Cecilia looked at him then. The simplicity of the statement struck painfully close to truth. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded behind her across the pier. Slow. Familiar. Lucian. Cecilia felt his presence before turning fully toward him. Dark coat buttoned high against the wind. Hair slightly damp from harbor mist. Tired gray eyes fixed immediately on her with unsettling intensity. Elias straightened subtly beside the railing. Not defensive exactly. Aware. Lucian noticed that at once. The air between both men tightened almost imperceptibly. Cecilia stepped forward before silence sharpened further. Mr. Mercer was only helping repair the docks. Lucian's gaze shifted briefly toward the carpenter. I did not accuse him of anything. Elias folded the cloth calmly into his pocket. Good morning, Your Grace. Lucian inclined his head once. Aristocratic politeness wrapped tightly around something far less comfortable beneath it. Mr. Mercer. Cecilia watched the exchange carefully. Strange. A week ago she would have worried instinctively about smoothing tension before it formed. Today she simply felt tired. Elias glanced toward her once more. Storms returning tonight. The northern path floods after dark. Cecilia nodded. Thank you. Then he left them alone beside the water. Wind moved sharply across the harbor once he disappeared down the dock. Cecilia kept her eyes fixed on the waves rather than Lucian beside her. You dislike him. I do not know him. That has never stopped you disliking people before. Lucian looked at her sharply. To his surprise, Cecilia almost smiled faintly afterward. The expression vanished quickly. Yet it unsettled him anyway because it reminded him how rarely she used humor around him anymore. You seem comfortable here, he said quietly after a moment. Cecilia watched a fishing boat drift slowly through the mist. Comfortable is not the same thing as happy. Are you happy? The question arrived too quickly. Too honestly. Cecilia looked at him then. Sea wind lifted loose strands of dark hair across her face while gulls circled overhead through the pale sky. I think, she answered carefully, I am finally beginning to feel peaceful. Lucien lowered his gaze briefly toward the wet wooden boards beneath them. Peaceful. Mrs. Alden used the same word the night before. Strange how everyone in Greyhaven seemed to recognize something about Cecilia. He completely missed while sharing a home with her for 3 years. I never wanted you unhappy. Cecilia's expression softened slightly then. Not forgiveness. Weariness. I know. The answer surprised him. You do. Yes. She folded her arms tighter against the wind. That was part of what made everything so lonely. Lucien frowned faintly. Cecilia turned toward him fully now. Cruel men are easier to leave. You were never cruel. Her voice dropped quieter. You simply loved me carefully instead of completely. The words settled deep enough that he physically felt them. Lucien stared at her while realization moved slowly through him once again. All those years he believed restraint made him honorable, safe, stable. Yet somehow his carefulness starved her more effectively than open rejection ever could have. Cecilia looked away first. I should not have stayed so long waiting for affection you did not know how to give. Cecilia. No, she shook her head softly. Please do not apologize yet. I do not think either of us fully understands what happened to our marriage. Wind pushed harder against the pier. Rain clouds gathered slowly farther out across the sea. Lucien stepped closer unconsciously. Then help me understand. Cecilia looked at him with something dangerously close to sadness. You noticed me most when I disappeared. Silence followed immediately after. Waves crashed below the docks beneath them. Somewhere down the harbor, fishermen shouted over tangled nets and rising wind. Ordinary life continued while Lucien stood motionless beside the woman he finally realized he loved too late and understood almost nothing about. I noticed you before that, he said quietly. Cecilia's eyes searched his face. Then why did I spend so many nights feeling invisible beside you? He opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. Because the horrifying truth remained simple. He did not know. Or perhaps he did know and feared the answer too much to say aloud. Lucien had spent his entire life loving through responsibility instead of vulnerability, providing instead of confessing, protecting instead of reaching. Cecilia needed warmth. He offered structure. She needed to be chosen openly. He assumed remaining beside her silently was enough. My father loved my mother very quietly, he admitted after a long silence. Cecilia waited without interrupting. After she died, he told me strong men do not survive by needing too much from anyone. Lucien stared toward the rough water beyond the harbor. I think somewhere along the way I confused emotional distance with strength. Cecilia's expression changed then. Pain mixed suddenly with understanding. And I confused patience with love. The honesty between them felt sharper than any argument they ever survived together. No raised voices. No accusations. Just two exhausted people finally speaking truth after years of silence ruined them slowly from the inside. Rain began lightly against the harbor moments later. Small cold drops striking the water around the pier. Cecilia pulled her coat tighter automatically. Without thinking, Lucien removed his gloves and stepped closer to shield her from the worst of the wind. The movement happened instinctively. Familiar. Cecilia froze slightly beneath it. So did he. Because for one brief fragile second, they remembered exactly how easy caring for each other once felt before loneliness entered the marriage and quietly made strangers of them both. Lucien looked down at her standing close beside him beneath the growing rain. Come back with me, he whispered. Cecilia closed her eyes briefly. The plea in his voice nearly destroyed her because she had waited years to hear him sound like he needed her. Yet timing mattered cruelly in love. I cannot return simply because you miss me now. Lucien's hand tightened slightly around the coat draped protectively near her shoulder. Then what do you need from me? Cecilia looked up at him slowly. Her eyes shimmered faintly beneath the gray harbor light. I need to know whether you love me because losing me hurts. Her voice trembled once before steadying again. Or because you finally see me clearly for the first time. The storm reached Greyhaven shortly after sunset. Wind rattled the harbor windows hard enough to shake the olden walls while rain swept sideways across the docks in silver sheets. Most of the fishing boats returned early before dark, their lanterns flickering weakly through the mist before disappearing safely into harbor. Cecilia stood beside the upstairs window watching the weather consume the coastline inch by inch. Somewhere below, Mrs. Alden hurried through the dining room securing shutters while guests gathered closer to the fire with steaming mugs between their hands. The entire town felt wrapped inside the storm together. Small, vulnerable, human. A soft knock came at her door around 8 o'clock. Cecilia already knew it was Lucien. She had begun recognizing his silence before he even entered rooms. "Come in." Lucien stepped inside carrying a folded wool blanket draped across one arm. Rain darkened the shoulders of his coat. His hair remained damp from the harbor wind. Mrs. Alden said the upstairs rooms lose heat during storms. Cecilia looked at the blanket quietly. "You brought this yourself?" "Yes." Something inside her chest twisted painfully at the simplicity of it. Strange how small gestures became dangerous after years spent starving for them. Lucien crossed toward the fireplace and placed the blanket carefully beside her chair. Neither spoke immediately afterward. The room glowed softly beneath candlelight while rain hammered the windows overlooking the harbor. Cecilia remained near the glass. Lucien stood near the fire. 3 years of marriage and they still struggled standing in the same room without distance separating them. Finally Lucien spoke first. "I have been thinking about what you asked me earlier." Cecilia lowered her gaze slightly toward the storm outside. "And?" Lucien exhaled slowly. "I do not believe I came here only because losing you hurt." His voice remained calm, honest in a way that frightened him more than anger ever had. "I think losing you forced me to confront how much of my life revolved around your presence before I fully understood what that presence meant to me." Cecilia turned slowly toward him. He continued before losing courage. "You asked whether I finally see you clearly." Lucien's gray eyes held hers steadily now. "The truth is I think I have been seeing pieces of you for years without allowing myself to understand what I was looking at." Silence settled softly between them. Rain moved harder against the windows. Cecilia wrapped her arms lightly around herself. "That sounds very beautiful," she said quietly. "But it also sounds dangerously close to regret instead of love." The words landed carefully, not cruelly. Yet Lucien still felt them. Because she deserved proof now, not eloquent sorrow arriving too late. He crossed toward the desk near the bed and rested one hand against its edge. "Do you remember the winter gala at Blackmere during our first year of marriage?" Cecilia frowned faintly. "Barely. You wore silver that evening." Surprise flickered briefly across her face. Lucien noticed. "You told me the ballroom chandeliers gave you headaches because the crystals reflected too sharply against the marble walls." He looked toward the fire thoughtfully. "The following week I had half the candles replaced with warmer glass shades." Cecilia stared at him in silence. "I thought the staff changed them." "No." Lucien's mouth tightened slightly. "I did." The room grew very quiet after that. Cecilia remembered the chandeliers. Remembered the softer light afterward. She simply never imagined Lucien noticed her discomfort enough to alter anything because of it. "Why did you never tell me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. "Because somewhere along the way I learned that caring silently was safer than speaking openly." His expression darkened faintly. "And because I believed actions should be enough." Cecilia turned away toward the storm again. Tears threatened unexpectedly behind her eyes. "They were not." "I know." Rain struck the harbor glass violently for several seconds before easing slightly again. Downstairs someone laughed near the fire. The inn breathed warmly beneath the storm while upstairs 2 people stood inside the wreckage of a marriage neither fully understood how to repair. Lucien moved closer slowly, careful not to crowd her. "There are things I need to tell you." Cecilia closed her eyes briefly. "Lucien, please." The quietness in his voice stopped her. She turned toward him again. For the first time since arriving in Greyhaven, Lucien looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. Not the controlled Duke of Blackmere standing before Parliament or commanding a state staff with effortless authority. Just a tired man carrying regret too heavy to hide anymore. "I never loved Vivian." Cecilia flinched slightly despite herself. Lucien noticed instantly. "No," he continued softly. "Listen to me." He stepped closer again. "What you heard that night was not love. It was cowardice." Cecilia's throat tightened painfully. You said the words. Yes. Shame moved visibly across his face now. Because Vivian was easy to admire publicly. She fit the version of life society expected from me before our marriage. His gaze never left hers. But loving you required vulnerability I did not know how to survive at the time. Cecilia looked down at her hands. That does not change what it felt like hearing you say it. I know. His voice roughened unexpectedly. God, Cecilia. I know. Silence followed. Heavy now. Honest. Lucian reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat, then withdrew a folded page worn soft along the edges. Cecilia recognized her own handwriting immediately. One of the unfinished letters. You took them with you? Only this one. He unfolded the paper carefully between his fingers. I have read this sentence every night since finding it. Cecilia's breath caught slightly. Lucian looked down at the page once before reading quietly. I think I could survive being unloved. I cannot survive being unnecessary. The storm outside seemed to vanish completely after that. Cecilia stared at him while emotion moved suddenly and violently through her chest. Humiliation. Grief. Relief. Because someone had finally hurt her. Truly hurt her. Lucian lowered the letter slowly. You were never unnecessary. Cecilia laughed once beneath her breath. Broken this time. Lucian, the entire point is that I felt that way beside you. He crossed the remaining distance between them then. Close enough that she could see exhaustion etched beneath his eyes from too many sleepless nights. Then I failed you more completely than I understood. The honesty in his voice stripped something fragile open inside her. Cecilia looked away immediately toward the rain-dark harbor. I do not know what to do with this now. Neither do I. He answered without hesitation. But I know I cannot return to pretending I feel nothing anymore. Her chest tightened painfully again. Because all her life Cecilia had wanted only this. Not grand declarations. Not obsession. Simply honesty. Simple open affection offered freely instead of carefully rationed through duty and restraint. Yet now that it finally stood before her, she no longer trusted herself enough to reach toward it safely. You hurt me, she whispered. Lucian closed his eyes briefly. I know. And part of me still loves you enough that it frightens me. His expression changed instantly at the confession. Something raw moved across his face before settling into quiet devastation. Cecilia. That is the problem. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to steady it. If I return too quickly, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether your love arrived only after my absence became inconvenient. Lucian stared at her for several long seconds. Then slowly he nodded once. Acceptance. Painful and deserved. Then do not return quickly. Cecilia blinked softly. What? Stay here if you need to. He looked around the small harbor room before forcing himself to continue. Take whatever time allows you to feel safe with me again. Cecilia searched his face carefully. You would permit that? A faint shadow crossed his expression. I think perhaps husbands should stop confusing love with permission. The sentence struck her silent. Lucian looked toward the storm beyond the windows before speaking again more quietly. I spent years assuming you would remain beside me because you always had. His eyes returned to hers slowly. Losing you taught me how dangerous certainty can become when it replaces gratitude. Cecilia felt tears slide finally down one cheek before she could stop them. Lucian noticed immediately yet did not move toward her this time. Did not attempt to wipe them away or claim intimacy he had not yet earned back. Instead he remained exactly where he stood and allowed her sadness space to exist openly between them for perhaps the first time in their marriage. Outside, thunder rolled softly above the sea while Greyhaven Harbor disappeared beneath rain and darkness. Inside the small upstairs room, Lucian Ravenscroft looked at his wife not as a duty or a quiet presence beside him, but as the woman whose absence had finally forced him to understand the unbearable cost of loving someone too carefully to make them feel wanted. The storm passed sometime before dawn. Cecilia knew before opening her eyes because silence had replaced the wind. No rain against the windows. No thunder rolling over the harbor. Only distant gulls crying softly somewhere beyond the cliffs, and the steady rhythm of waves returning calmly against the docks below. Pale morning light spilled through the curtains in thin silver lines across the floorboards. Cecilia remained motionless beneath the blankets for several seconds, staring toward the ceiling while memories from the previous night moved carefully through her chest. Lucien standing beside the fire with her unfinished letter trembling slightly in his hand. Lucien admitting he confused distance with strength. Lucien telling her not to return until she felt safe with him again. Strange. She had spent years imagining what it would feel like hearing him speak honestly. Somehow the reality hurt more than silence ever did. A soft knock came downstairs around 7 o'clock, followed by Mrs. Alden's voice drifting faintly upward through the hall. Morningtide came in clear today. Another voice answered quietly. Lucien. Cecilia closed her eyes briefly. He was still here. Part of her expected him to vanish before sunrise the way powerful men often retreated after vulnerability exposed too much of them. Yet he remained. The realization settled somewhere deep and uncertain inside her. When Cecilia finally descended an hour later, she found Lucien seated alone near the harbor windows with untouched coffee cooling beside his hand. He wore the same dark trousers from yesterday, though his coat hung across the chair nearby. Signs of exhaustion remained visible beneath his eyes. Still, when he noticed her crossing the room, something in his expression softened immediately. Not dramatically, quietly, like warmth returning slowly after winter. Cecilia stopped near the table. You stayed. Lucien looked up at her. I said I would. She nodded once before sitting across from him. Outside, Greyhaven Harbor glittered faintly beneath early morning sunlight breaking through the remaining clouds. Fishing boats moved steadily through the water while townspeople crossed the docks carrying crates and lanterns as though storms never lasted long enough to stop life entirely. Mrs. Alden approached with fresh tea and warm bread before retreating discreetly toward the kitchen again. Neither Lucien nor Cecilia touched the food immediately. Silence settled between them. Different now from the painful silence that once lived inside Blackmere House. Less suffocating. Still fragile. But honest. Finally Lucien spoke quietly. I wrote to Parliament this morning. Cecilia looked up. About what? I postpone next week's sessions. Surprise flickered briefly across her face. Lucien, you never postpone parliamentary obligations. No, he wrapped both hands loosely around the untouched coffee cup. Apparently I should have postponed more things before my marriage collapsed. The blunt honesty startled a soft breath of laughter from Cecilia before she could stop herself. Both of them froze slightly afterward. Because it had been so long since something between them felt natural instead of careful. Lucien stared at her quietly. There it is. Cecilia frowned faintly. What? That sound. His mouth softened almost imperceptibly. I forgot how your laugh changes when you are not pretending. Something tightened painfully inside her chest again. She looked down toward the table quickly. You notice strange things lately? No, his voice remained calm. I think I noticed them before, and simply failed to understand their importance. The words lingered softly between them while sunlight shifted slowly across the harbor windows. Cecilia traced one fingertip lightly along the edge of her teacup. What happens now? Lucien answered honestly. I do not know. She appreciated that more than certainty, because certainty had nearly destroyed them both. Outside the inn, Elias Mercer crossed the harbor carrying lumber across one shoulder when he noticed Cecilia through the windows beside the Duke. He slowed briefly before continuing down the pier without interruption. Lucien followed Cecilia's gaze toward the docks. You trust him? Cecilia looked back toward the harbor. I barely know him. That is not what I said. She remained quiet several seconds. He listened to me without trying to solve my sadness. Lucien absorbed that silently. Another failure added quietly to the growing list he carried now. I spent years trying to manage pain instead of understanding it, he admitted. My father believed emotions became dangerous once spoken aloud. Cecilia's eyes softened slightly. And your mother? Lucien looked toward the sunlight reflecting across the water. She loved him loudly anyway. A faint shadow crossed his face at the memory. I think part of him loved her just as deeply. He simply treated tenderness like weakness until she died before he learned otherwise. Cecilia felt sudden sorrow move through her at the quietness in his voice. You were afraid becoming vulnerable would destroy your control. Yes. He looked back toward her steadily now. And you were afraid asking for love would make you difficult to keep. Silence followed immediately after because both statements carried unbearable truth. Cecilia lowered her eyes toward the folded napkin beside her plate. We were very lonely together. Lucian closed his eyes briefly. God. The single word sounded almost broken. For several moments neither spoke again. Then quietly, Cecilia asked the question she avoided since the night in the library. Why did you say those things about Vivian? Lucian went still across from her. The harbor noises outside seemed to fade beneath the weight of the question. Because I was frustrated. Cecilia looked at him carefully. With me. With myself. He exhaled slowly before continuing. Vivian represented a version of life that required nothing emotionally complicated from me. Admiration. Charm. Simplicity. Shame flickered visibly beneath his expression. And instead of confronting how disconnected I felt from my own emotions, I said something careless and cruel because pretending affection for someone easier frightened me less than admitting I already loved my wife badly. Cecilia stared at him in silence. Loved my wife badly. Strange phrase. Honest enough to hurt. You did love me then. It was not truly a question. Lucian nodded once. I simply loved you in ways too restrained to feel safe beside. Cecilia felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes again. Not from heartbreak this time. Mourning perhaps. Mourning all the years lost because two wounded people mistook silence for strength. She looked toward the harbor quickly before speaking. Do you know what finally broke me that night? Lucian waited quietly. It was not hearing you mention Vivian. Her fingers tightened lightly around the teacup. It was hearing softness in your voice and realizing I had spent years convincing myself I did not need something that simple from you. Lucian stared at her as though the confession physically wounded him. Cecilia. I could survive distance. I could survive duty. Her voice trembled faintly now. I just could not survive believing I inspired tenderness in everyone except my own husband. Lucian looked down immediately. For the first time in his life, shame moved through him without defense rising behind it. Because she was right. He gave strangers easier warmth than the woman sleeping beside him each night. Not because he valued her less. Because he valued her enough to fear needing her completely. The realization felt monstrous now. I do not deserve how patiently you loved me, he said quietly after a long silence. Cecilia watched him carefully across the small harbor table. The old Lucian would never have admitted such a thing aloud. Pride once protected him from vulnerability with almost ruthless discipline. Yet this man sitting before her looked stripped down to honesty and exhaustion, and something frighteningly close to devotion. Maybe not, she answered softly. But that does not mean I stopped loving you. Lucian's eyes lifted sharply to hers. Cecilia looked away almost immediately afterward, embarrassed by her own honesty. Outside, sunlight spread brighter across the harbor while fishermen shouted over the docks and life continued steadily around them. Inside the small inn dining room, Lucian Ravenscroft realized with painful clarity that Cecilia still loved him despite everything, and the knowledge did not make him feel victorious. It made him feel humbled enough to finally understand love was never something quietly earned through duty alone. It was something that had to be spoken before silence convinced the other person they were surviving it alone. 3 days later, the sun returned fully to Greyhaven. The harbor glittered beneath clear autumn light while fishing boats drifted slowly across calm blue water beyond the docks. Cecilia stood outside the inn that morning watching gulls circle overhead through cold coastal wind. The town had begun feeling strangely familiar now. Mrs. Alden saving the warmest bread for her at breakfast. Children running along the piers after supper. Elias waving once from the carpenter's workshop whenever she crossed the harbor road. Small things. Human things. The kind of quiet life Cecilia once believed impossible for someone carrying a title heavy enough to erase individuality beneath it. Behind her, the inn door opened softly. Lucian stepped outside adjusting dark leather gloves against the morning chill. Cecilia no longer startled at the sight of him here. Somehow that frightened her more than distance ever had. Because over the past few days, Lucian had changed in ways too subtle for anyone except his wife to notice. He listened fully now when she spoke. He thanked servants directly instead of assuming efficiency existed naturally around him. Twice she caught him smiling faintly while watching her laugh at something Mrs. Alden said over supper. Not performative smiles. Unconscious ones. Like a man rediscovering warmth after years spent surviving winter indoors. Lucien moved beside her near the harbor railing. You slept better. Cecilia glanced toward him with mild surprise. How do you know? You stopped looking exhausted when you came downstairs. She almost smiled. You truly are noticing strange things lately. No, his voice remained quiet. Certain. I am noticing the woman I married instead of assuming she will remain beside me regardless. The honesty still unsettled her every time. Cecilia looked back toward the sea quickly before he noticed emotion moving through her expression again. Silence settled comfortably between them while sunlight moved across the water. Finally Lucien spoke. There is something I need to ask you. Cecilia's fingers tightened slightly around the railing. That sounds ominous. A faint shadow of amusement crossed his mouth before disappearing. Probably. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat slowly. Cecilia watched confusion replace caution across his face as he withdrew a small velvet box. Black. Familiar. Her breath caught instantly. Lucien opened it quietly between them. Inside rested her wedding ring. Gold catching pale morning light against dark velvet. Cecilia stared at it without breathing for one terrible second. You kept it with you. Lucien looked down at the ring before answering. I carried it every day since finding it on your desk. Cecilia swallowed carefully against sudden emotion tightening her throat. The harbor noises around them seemed distant now. Waves. Gulls. Footsteps along the pier. Everything blurred beneath the unbearable tenderness of seeing the ring again, after believing that chapter of her life had ended completely. I am not asking you to put it back on. Lucien's voice remained steady, though she could hear strain beneath it. Not yet. Cecilia lifted her eyes slowly toward him. Lucien closed the box gently before continuing. When we married, I thought love meant permanence. Duty. Stability. His gaze never left hers. I understand now those things matter very little if the person beside you feels emotionally abandoned anyway. Cecilia felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Lucien stepped closer slowly. I cannot promise perfection. His expression softened painfully. But I can promise I will never again allow you to question whether your existence matters to me. The simplicity of the statement nearly broke her. No grand speech. No theatrical declaration. Just honesty spoken carefully by a man finally brave enough to love openly. Cecilia looked away toward the sea because suddenly she could not bear the intensity of his eyes on her. You make everything sound easy now. No, he shook his head once. I think loving someone properly is probably the hardest thing I have ever attempted. That startled another small laugh from her. Lucien's expression changed instantly at the sound. Softer. Warmer. God. Cecilia realized suddenly he had spent days looking at her the way starving people look toward light. Not possessively. Gratefully. Cecilia. She turned back toward him slowly. Lucien inhaled once. Then before pride or fear could stop him this time, he said the words quietly into the morning harbor wind. I love you. Silence followed immediately afterward. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind carrying years of things left unsaid too long. Cecilia stared at him while emotion moved violently through her chest. Because she had imagined hearing those words from him so many times, she no longer believed reality could survive the fantasy of them. Yet here they were. No ballroom. No audience. Just Lucien Ravenscroft standing beside cold ocean water, finally speaking love plainly instead of hiding it beneath duty and restraint. Say something, he whispered after several seconds. Cecilia laughed shakily through sudden tears. You spent 3 years emotionally constipated and now you are impatient? To her complete shock, Lucien laughed softly. Genuinely. The sound warmed something deep inside her so quickly it almost hurt. He reached toward her instinctively before stopping himself halfway. Waiting. Asking silently for permission now instead of assuming it. Cecilia noticed that too. God. She noticed everything now. Slowly, carefully, she closed the remaining distance herself. Lucien's hand settled against her waist with such reverence it nearly undid her completely. I still love you too, she admitted quietly against the space between them. Lucian closed his eyes briefly at the confession. Relief moved visibly through him, deep enough that she realized he truly believed he might have destroyed them beyond repair. "But I am still afraid," Cecilia whispered honestly. His hand tightened slightly against her coat. "Then let me earn back your trust, frightened piece by frightened piece." Tears slipped finally down her cheeks. Lucian brushed one away gently with his thumb. Such a small gesture. Yet tenderness delivered openly after years of starvation became almost unbearable in its intimacy. "You know," Cecilia said softly through uneven breathing, "Mrs. Alden told me something yesterday." Lucian looked down at her carefully. "What?" "She said some marriages survive because people finally learn how to speak before silence finishes killing them." Lucian's expression darkened faintly at the truth inside those words. "We came dangerously close." "Yes." Cecilia looked toward the water once more. "I think part of me had already started mourning you while still sleeping beside you every night." Pain flickered visibly across his face. Yet he did not look away from it anymore. That was the difference now. Lucian no longer retreated from emotional honesty simply because it hurt. Instead, he remained standing inside it beside her. "Then let me give you something new to remember instead." Cecilia studied him quietly for several long seconds. Then finally, slowly, she reached toward the velvet box still resting in his hand. Lucian went completely still. Cecilia opened it herself this time. The gold ring shimmered softly beneath the harbor sunlight. She touched it carefully with one fingertip before looking back up at him. "Not because I owe you forgiveness," she whispered. "And not because I am afraid to leave." Lucian's gray eyes never moved from hers. Cecilia slipped the ring gently back onto her finger. "Because for the first time since our wedding, I think you finally chose me willingly." Something inside Lucian's expression broke open then. Not composure exactly. Relief too profound for dignity to contain properly. He bent his forehead slowly against hers while sea wind moved softly around them and harbor bells rang somewhere across the water beneath the brightening sky. Neither spoke for several seconds. They simply stood there together beside the ocean while sunlight spread across Greyhaven Harbor, and two people who nearly lost each other to silence finally learned that love surviving heartbreak required more than devotion hidden quietly inside actions alone. It required courage enough to say the words before absence made them impossible to hear.